a different scenario involving personal threat. We've talked about home invasion. We've talked about being assaulted at a political rally. We've talked about attacks on business. We talked about attacks on public facilities, such as a courthouse. We discussed a community attack on a small neighborhood within an inner city. We described a road rage attack from a husband and wife standpoint. We even talked about a school attack, not unlike the attack that was experienced in Beslan back in 2004. Each one of these webinars was meant as a building block to get us to where we are today. And the agenda today is to pull all that together and describe what steps you need to take in order to build a private defense network. Before I do that, I just want to very briefly tell you about Pulse. And from the standpoint of what we do, because it directly influences the content you're about to hear. We provide combative firearms instruction. We train individuals, teams, and units to defend life and property. We use a training ladder in order to move a firearms novice through 4 stages of skill development. That begins with firearm fundamentals on handgun, shotgun, and rifle, proceeds to individual tactics from the standpoint of the ability to maneuver with a loaded weapon in defense of home and also on the street. We then take the next step up on the ladder, which is team tactics, where we train individuals both as micro teams and up to 6-man teams in order to defend a specific facility, such as a business, school, or church. And then we culminate at the top with unit tactics, which is where we train individuals and teams in order to defend a territory or a geography, specifically a territory described by a community or neighborhood that would be composed of multiple facilities, organizations, residences, and within that to be able to defend against some form of violent threat. We offer essentially 4 types of service offerings. You can come to us and take our training courses and programs. We'll go to you and do on-site engagements for businesses, churches, schools, and communities. You can buy our training manuals. We have developed 7 training manuals that describe our training ladder and overall curriculum. And you can also purchase memberships in our hub, our online hub called the O2DA Defense Academy. This is where individuals, teams, and units can take their training curriculum and process online and use our content in order to help with their overall training process. This is important because the O2DA Defense Academy is a paid monthly subscription site. Everybody on the call, all attendees, get a free 14-day trial membership to the O2DA Defense Academy, and that's important because inside the Defense Academy you will find all of the prior webinar replays along with downloads. And since the last webinar, we have now taken 8 of the previous webinars, actually 7 of the previous webinars, and we've now converted those webinars into actual courses that you can take online inside of the Defense Academy, including quizzes. So if you want to go back and revisit any of the prior scenarios, the actual historical examples and hypothetical scenarios, you can now do that in a course format. So that also now is available to all members of the O2DA Defense Academy. So let's dive into today's content, which is to build a strategic blueprint for private defense networks. What we're going to do with the webinar today is describe how individual civilians can take control of their security in order to defend life and property. Let's first off talk about what a private defense network is and what it isn't. A network, in this sense, is a collection of individuals, businesses, schools, churches who share roles, identities, and activities that might be subject to threat. Businesses, schools, churches, and communities organize individuals for specific tasks. These organizations can be leveraged to defend individuals and organizations that might come under threat. The fundamental building block of a private defense network is the individual. This is a theme that we have visited throughout all of the webinars. And from the standpoint of a private defense network, individuals take on multiple roles, such as a husband, father, wife, daughter, son, employee, manager, owner, pastor, teacher, cop, soldier, etc., or identities, as described by things like race, education, union, trade, business, religion, ethnicity, clubs, lifestyle, etc., etc. Roles and identities form the basic building blocks of networks. We see examples of this every day in descriptions like African American mothers, white fathers, Jewish scholars, Palestinian business owners, Christian bakers, etc. Building blocks essentially involve simpatico. Simpatico is a word we will use throughout this webinar, and the very essence of simpatico involves being on the same wavelength. The essence of a private defense network, the essence of these initial building blocks revolve around simpatico and individuals with various roles and ideas being simpatico, otherwise being on the same wavelength. Not surprisingly, people with similar identities tend to congregate together and live in close proximity. Quite often, individual identity is attached to a geography, a block, neighborhood, village, or town. Despite the best efforts of bad policy, the United States has attempted to force individuals with different identities to associate, leading to the friction resulting from forcing somebody to do something that is against their will. One of the primary reasons why we're seeing the polarization in the U.S. today and the resulting friction. The fundamental purpose of a private defense network is to organize individuals, businesses, churches, schools, and communities to defend against violent threat to life and property. More specifically, the PDN will recruit, train, and manage members, finance activities and equipment, and deploy for specific threats. As to the threats, we are facing literally a dizzying array of threats here in the U.S. and abroad. Back to my opening comments, when we started putting this together in April, there's no way that we could envision, there's no way that we would have thought that anything like the Dallas cop massacre would have happened. The San Bernardino terrorist attack is from the traditional playbook. The civil disturbances, however, that we're starting to see primarily from the Black Lives Matter movement is very disturbing to us from the standpoint of what their objectives are and the means that they're going about in order to accomplish those objectives. Active shooters we've been well aware of, or active murderers, simply because they're using a gun does not necessarily mean it bad, because the good guys will be shooting back in order to neutralize that active murderer. Gang wars, the array goes on and on. Because of this, we try to organize these threats in a manner that allow us to start to apply some organization to it. And from the standpoint of what we would characterize as the threats organized, or the threats facing private defense networks, there are 6 primary types of threats: criminals, organized crime, mob violence, cause-driven, terror, and extremist. And from the standpoint of targets, what we're doing here is looking at the various components within a private defense network as a target of that threat. So individual businesses, schools, churches, and communities are all potential targets of these kinds of threats. More specifically, from the standpoint of criminal threat, these are simple criminal acts: murder, assault, theft. Examples would be things like home invasion, carjacking, domestic abuse, flash mobs, crimes of passion, simple theft, etc. The primary target of criminal threat is individuals, although businesses, schools, churches, and communities certainly suffer from that. Generally, a petty criminal is going to go after an individual. Organized crime, in this case, we're talking about gang or group-directed violence, generally for economic enrichment or the defense of a territory. Examples of this would be street gangs, drug cartels, motorcycle clubs, crime syndicates like the mafia. Typical targets are individuals who would be the subject of shakedowns and other intimidation, and then businesses, where there is some attempt to put an illegal structure in place in order to exploit the business. Once again, while churches, schools, and communities feel the wrath of organized crime, their primary targets are individuals and businesses. Next up is mob violence. This is typically a random or spontaneous violent reaction to an event, and examples such as Ferguson, Baltimore, Oakland, and New Orleans. New Orleans specifically from the standpoint of Katrina. Oakland, Baltimore, Ferguson from the standpoint of mob violence with racial connotations. It's almost always, this type of violence is almost always race-based, with the periodic college or pro sport riot sprinkled in. It could also include natural disasters, as I just said, Katrina, where there might be a law enforcement void created by some natural catastrophe. The primary target of mob violence is the community. Once again, individuals, businesses, schools, and churches feel the wrath of mob violence, but the primary target will generally be the community itself. Next, we have cause-driven intimidation. Here we're talking about special interest groups adopting increasingly aggressive tactics in order to extort or threaten individuals, groups, or businesses to support their cause. This has long been a tactic used by a few groups, but over the past couple of years, this has been pretty much a weaponized a form of intimidation now used by many special interest groups. Examples of this include death threats refused by baker or death threats received by bakers who refuse to bake a cake for somebody with a lifestyle that they may disagree with, union intimidation at right-to-work hearings, the Black Lives Matter tactic of disrupting traffic and individuals from their daily lifestyle, and illegal alien border crossings, among many of the potential examples that we could put up here. The primary targets of cause-driven threats are businesses and the community itself. Once again, individuals, schools, and churches will feel the wrath of it, but their primary targets will be business and the community. Next up, we have terrorist attacks. This is what we traditionally think about when we talk about terrorists. Here we have an organized group that is inflicting violence in order to somehow enable their cause. Examples of this include ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Hamas, the PLF, and Boko Haram. The primary target is the community in this case. Once again, individuals, businesses, and schools, churches are feeling the wrath, but what they're attempting to do is terrorize a community. Last but not least, there are extremist attacks. That should say extremist there in that slot. Extremist attacks are lone individuals holding extreme or fanatical political or religious views who resort to violence in order to eliminate offending groups or threats. Examples of this include the Dallas massacre, police massacre by a black man, the massacre of the Charleston church members, black members by a white man, the Oklahoma beheading of a white Christian woman by a black Muslim convert. Once again, these are primarily individuals or lone wolves acting on their own. While they can certainly target individuals, their attacks always impact the overall community. Um, and so, with that, we
Mike, if I could,
absolutely, Ron.
yeah, and I think it's important here also to note a lot of these things we've been looking at, especially like in these extremist attacks over the years, they have been always a present and decentralized or a threat that has never been stoppable. You may, I'm not certain statistically if they're picking up now or if they're just being picked up upon now, but this really, when it comes down to it here, is the crux of it is that individual decentralized distributed threat that has always been present in society and will always be present in society. I think it's a good point to bring that up.
Yeah, excellent point, Ron. And if we just go back to the general matrix here, when you're looking at this, law enforcement will not be there for you at the point of contact unless you get lucky.
Um,
So,
Mike,
Bill?
yes, another thought here too. There's, as you look at this chart, uh, there's certainly a nexus between various of these threats that we may not see on the streets today, but we have certainly historical precedents for them. I think back into the late 1960s, early 1970s, where we saw a convergence of the anti-Vietnam War movement with the racial tensions of the era. You saw that, for instance, at the Chicago National Convention of the Democratic Party in 1968, where the civil disturbances originated with organized protests by the anti-war movement, but then you had racially motivated groups that piled into it and created a sort of a nexus of tensions and contributed to the violence and the chaos. We saw the same thing in Albuquerque and many other cities in that era where one cause or one confederation of groups would interact with another or draw others into their activities, and the sum would be much greater than the individual, or the total would be greater than the sum of the individual parts. And we may see that sort of thing developing again now.
One of the reasons we put together this chart is to simply remind people that we're facing numerous kinds of threat. It seems like each week there's a different flavor of the week for a threat. Last week it was an extremist taking out cops. This week it could be a terrorist attack in Europe. But each time there is that sort of threat, everybody kind of gets their head around the fact that, oh my God, we have this huge threat for terror, which we do, but not necessarily recalling the fact that terror or terrorism isn't necessarily the only threat and is not the only threat faced by folks here in the U.S. Okay, so how can private defense networks defend against these threats? Here are several short examples to kind of start to flesh this out. From the standpoint of a community, Black, white, Hispanic, and Asian residents. Here we're talking about identities to start off with. Black, white, Hispanic, and Asian residents of an inner city community might band together to create a private defense network to defend against criminal acts of violence. In other words, they band together in order to step in to a void created by the lack of law enforcement, for whatever reason, in order to defend their life and property. Another example would be a business example. A network of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim businesses. Again, we're looking at various identities coming together here because they're simpatico on the need in order to defend a violence-prone city block. And from that standpoint, they come together in order to put together a private defense network in order to defend against mob violence. Alternatively, a single business located in a crime-ridden inner city might develop its own security cadre in order to defend against gang-related violence that targets its management and its employees.
And Mike, I think it's important to point out here with these examples we're given, they're not just hypothetical examples. These are examples that do have a foothold in historic precedents that we're able to pull reference from, and as much as today, up until this point in time, where we have our special forces troops out in the world doing this exact same thing. Forwarded you an article earlier this week about SF now considering having their teams having an economic basis and understanding to bring that to the local populace. So again, we've said this throughout these series. We're not really coming up with anything new. We're just putting a whole bunch of things that have worked in the past together, and not just flying off the cuff. Thinking of things to do. This is stuff that actually works, as has been employed throughout the world numerous times.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Next up, church. A Christian megachurch might join with other Christian churches in their community to develop their own security cadre in order to defend against random extremist acts of violence. This is actually something we're currently working on with a client. Another example would be schools. A private Jewish school, once again, a very simpatico population, located in close proximity to a radical Islamic mosque, might band together with other private Jewish schools to develop a security cadre capable of defending against a potential terrorist attack targeting Jewish children. So let's talk about how we organize a private defense network. Networks need a means for organizing and coordinating their activities. It needs to create a simpatico environment. Once again, simpatico equals same wavelength. We are describing networks that are established in order to defend life and property. So we need an organizational structure best suited for coordinating, recruiting, training, managing, financing, and deploying. The best place to start as far as organizing a private defense network are existing organizations where individuals already gather to accomplish a specific objective, such as a community, a church, a school, or a business. What is the best method for organizing a PDN? Is there a best method for organizing a private defense network? Not necessarily. There are many different ways that one might go about organizing a private defense network. We're going to spend the rest of the webinar talking about what that looks like. But from the standpoint of starting to think about the best candidates for organizing a private defense network, at the top probably are businesses, because they're uniquely suited because of the activities they conduct and their economic role within the community. Businesses would recruit, train, and manage their own private security force, including building and maintaining their own training facilities. They could also form the hub of a local community, integrating local churches, businesses, and other and local churches, schools, and other businesses into one private defense network. But at the outset, most businesses will probably resist the notion of setting up a private defense network. Why is that? At first, well, let me skip this slide. Well, no, let me stay here for a second. Most businesses will be reluctant to consider taking on the role of developing a private defense network. There are several good reasons why. I mean, it's hard to argue with those reasons that we'll get to in a second. However, there are a small percentage of businesses currently located in high-risk locations: south side of Chicago, inner city of Detroit, Baltimore, Philly, Oakland, who potentially will be early adopters out of necessity. But with that being said, the reasons why most businesses will not additionally adopt this role or find reasons not to are, first off, they don't necessarily sense the threat. Although this is certainly changing almost by the day, that threat temperature continues to go up. But most businesses in the U.S. have not experienced a violent event and feel they will not be the target of a violent threat. However, as we're seeing more and more of these attacks come to our homeland or into the heartland, as we're seeing them occur on the periphery of major cities, more and more businesses will likely begin to feel the heat, and they'll start to sense the threat. Although based upon what's happened over the last several months, they may well already be sensing it. We are starting to see the indications of that from the standpoint of people contacting us. Second reason why businesses may not adopt this role. There is a notional sense that they already pay for this security via taxes for law enforcement. A reasonable question is, why should they have to do this on their own? I mean, a lot of businesses will say, I'm already paying for this. They already pay taxes for law enforcement. A good question, despite the reality that the security they think they're paying for will not be there when they need it. The next reason why businesses may not adopt the role of being a focus of a private defense network is because of the business practice of outsourcing all but the core competencies of the enterprise. Delegating the security of your enterprise to questionable third parties will not be a good practice going forward. Another reason why businesses may not adopt this role, lawyers will aggressively oppose this. All lawyers will advise businesses that this is a highly risky endeavor with significant civil and criminal penalties should things go wrong. Lawyers would rather see enterprises looted, employees slaughtered, and businesses destroyed before exposing their client to potential legal jeopardy should a training accident or innocent death occur. Last but not least, and our favorite, this type of training will scare employees. Yes, some employees will feel safer with gun-free zone signs plastered around the business. They will feel safer with the signs than having a cadre of well-armed and trained employees on site at the moment an active shooter appears. Having said that, though, businesses, from the standpoint of looking at the overall functionality and what our objective here, which is self-reliance within a community, businesses may well be best suited, despite those objections, to create private defense networks because, first and foremost, businesses already have the organizational infrastructure in place to build out private defense networks. The organizational requirements to recruit, train, and manage a PDN already exist in most businesses. A business would simply add a new department or function dedicated to security. Employees are excellent recruits. Employees within the business provide a built-in recruiting pool, some of whom will be military veterans or part-time first responders. With the proper curriculum, you can train almost anyone who is physically active and willing to be an effective member of a security cadre. All will have a vested interest in the security of the enterprise. The cost of maintaining a private defense network. Full-time employees already on enterprise payrolls would fill the ranks of private defense networks. Time spent training or deploying could be treated as temporary duty with increased pay and allowances. Rather than paying a third-party security force to be on call, enterprise employees would provide their own ready reserve while working at their day-to-day positions. Training an employee security cadre is not complicated. This is what we do every day, folks. We've been doing this for 30 years. Businesses train employees every day for various jobs and tasks. Training employees on basic firearm fundamentals and working together in micro teams and small units is doable with the proper training curriculum. Small enterprises and sole proprietorships might only train basic handgun skills while their larger counterparts would train full curriculums. Please understand, this is no more complicated than training other skilled positions in the enterprise. Next, businesses are the economic engines for local communities. As the economic engine for the local economy, businesses generate the revenue that pay wages, taxes, and fees to run the community. Cash flow originates from business, which enables other community functions to operate. Schools and churches do not generate cash flow per se. They are dependent upon contributions or tax revenue for their operating budget. This is a critical distinction, enabling the network to be truly resilient and not dependent upon third parties for their security. Cash flow to fund the network begins with the business. Most businesses are local. Businesses generally function within a local geography, street, block, neighborhood, or village. Local customers, local employees, and in some cases, local vendors with shared identities. Back to simpatico. Most private enterprises have a strong identity of interest between owners, managers, and employees to defend their community, setting up the opportunity to create a simpatico environment. They have a vested interest in providing security. Business owners and managers want to see their employees safe and secure, altruistically for their personal welfare and objectively for their contributions to running the business. Employees want to see their business safe and secure, objectively for their own personal safety and for the paycheck it provides. Next, businesses are currently paying for an inadequate security. Many businesses engage private security guards who can be expensive and undependable and can be replaced with a private defense network. All businesses pay indirectly via insurance premiums, taxes, and fees for inadequate security, which creates business losses and employee downtime. A private defense network focused on business creates resiliency. It reduces dependency. Rather than depending upon local law enforcement, the National Guard, or federal troops, businesses and communities they serve will now be self-reliant when it comes to defending their life and property. Businesses can provide a better efficiency at managing security budgets rather than funneling tax dollars and fees through the bureaucratic sieve of local, state, and federal government. The dollar spent on security will stay at the source and be managed much more efficiently. Last but most important is home court advantage. As Dave Grossman, former psychology professor and former Army Ranger, describes, one of the major manifestations of moral distance is what might be called the home court advantage. The moral advantage associated with defending one's own den, home, or nation has a long tradition that can be found in the animal kingdom as well and should not be neglected in assessing the impact of moral distance in empowering a nation's violence. Winston Churchill said that it is the primary right of men to die and kill for the land they live in and to punish with exceptional severity all members of their own race who have warmed their hands at the invader's hearth. So, how can businesses finance private defense networks? Weapons, ammunition, and training cost money. One of the greatest challenges facing those who are responsible for the defense of a country or the security of a population is funding the effort. Since the Peace de Westphalia, taxation has been the primary source of funding for war and law enforcement. The inability of government to efficiently manage these efforts is not in dispute. Whether it is a country waging war or a county providing law enforcement, finding a mechanism to pay for the efforts has always been a struggle and will be for businesses. So how do businesses finance a private defense network? First off, reduced regulatory burden. You need to stick with me on this because this is going to be somewhat counterintuitive to or controversial to start off with, but stick with me as we work through this. Businesses can finance their own PDN by eliminating all human resources, legal, and accounting overhead. Yeah, I said that. Elimination of all human resources, legal, and accounting overhead. The average small business with less than 500 employees pays approximately $10,000 per year per employee in order to conform with federal and state regulations. Stop and think about that for a second. Federal and state regulations are costing small enterprises $10,000 per employee per year. For a company with 100 employees, that's $1 million a year. 1/10 of that amount, $100,000, would underwrite a robust, business-centric private defense network with 100 employees. But we just can't stop paying for the overhead lawyers and accountants necessary to conform to these regulations. We are all law-abiding citizens. We will continue to do so. However, if we continue to take a look at where things are going, the power of the state continues to deteriorate, and its ability to collect fees and enforce these regulations will also suffer. There is a growing movement among smaller enterprises to consider acts of civil disobedience, including non-payment of fees and taxes, and in many cases simply not complying with many regulations. Obviously, the state will not give this power up without a battle. And once again, where required, where by law we're supposed to do this, we're not remotely suggesting that you should do anything against the law, but we're simply looking forward here at what we think will likely transpire. We think the writing is on the wall, and one way or another, the regulatory costs will come down. And as they do, a portion of these savings can be applied to the development and maintenance of a private defense network. Next method that businesses can use in order to pay for their private defense network: insourcing private security. Right now, many enterprises engage private security guards to protect both life and property. Depending upon the experience and requirements for these guards, the cost for private security, depending upon the experience and requirement for the guards, the cost for private security can be significant. One of the capabilities of a fully built-out private defense network would be the ability to replace outsourced private security, and with that, the resulting savings helping to finance, if not pay for, the private defense network. The third way that businesses can pay for a private defense network is by outsourcing the PDN. In number 2, we talked about insourcing, where they replace existing security firms with their own capability in-house. Here we're talking about outsourcing the private defense network, and in this case, the business could offer its security capabilities to other enterprises or private defense networks on a contract basis. The most likely scenario here would be the larger enterprises who develop a private defense network may do so from the standpoint of having facilities, of having a total curriculum. Their ability to contract out some of those capabilities to smaller enterprises that might not have the ability to do that would be one way for them to start to help to pay for some of the costs associated with running the private defense network. In order to do that, they would likely have to establish a licensed security firm or create a private security enterprise. But nonetheless, the opportunity would be there. In essence, what happens with item 3 here is that the private defense network becomes a core competency of the business, and as such, they might profit by selling this capability to other enterprises and organizations within their community. So, while the development of a PDN is not contemplated to be a profit-generating activity, businesses are uniquely situated to develop the means by which they might offset the cost of the private defense network, if not profit from the activities of the private defense network. So let's work through the specific sets here to close out the specific steps to develop a private defense network. What we're suggesting is that the primary organizing scheme for a private defense network should focus on business, but the individual civilian is the core contributor. While many enterprises may provide fundamental firearms training for their individual employees, Individuals can seek out their own training should their employer not provide it.
Mike,
Individuals, hello?
Mike, yeah.
Yeah.
Let me point out something here from a purely historical perspective, as we like to say, past is often prologue. What Mike just said there has been the classic organizing concept for citizen militias from the days of the Greek city-states in ancient times through Anglo-Saxon England and right up to the founding period of the American colonies and the early United States, where citizen militias are formed from the basic building block of individual citizens who provide their own weapons and an assurance of their own competence in using those weapons. So we have a long historical precedent for the concept we're talking about here.
Thank you, Bill. So, individual civilians stand at the center of private defense networks, which are based upon the roles and identities of the individual: men, women, husbands, wives, fathers, mothers, church members, PTA members, employees, business owners, and citizens of local communities. Each role and/or identity is a potential network node. Networks are assembled with other simpatical individuals who share intuition, trust, vision, and initiative. Step one in developing a private defense network, therefore, starts with yourself. Purchase a handgun and get quality training. At the bare minimum, you need basic proficiency utilizing a handgun for self-defense in order to be of value to your network. Learn how to defend your home and family from lethal threat. Next step, think about your immediate network. Start with your business or place of employment. Investigate the possibilities of your business or your employer to undertake the development of a private defense network. Just because you may not want to expand your competencies and capabilities beyond the utilization of a handgun doesn't mean that you can't be a major contributor towards building out that private defense network by reaching out to various organizations that you interface with in your community day in and day out. The first place to start would be your business or place of employment. Next, reaching out to the schools where your children attend or the schools in your community, and churches of various faiths, again, located within your community. And with that, from the standpoint of community, at the final iteration of a private defense network would involve the integration of many businesses, schools, churches, and individuals throughout a community in order to defend that community. A fully developed private defense network integrates individuals, businesses, schools, and churches community-wide. This is a classic decentralized form of organization. There is no one, there is not a bureaucracy, there is not one central organizing entity. These are all independent entities that come together and break apart based upon the threats as they manifest. So that concludes the content for today. You will find in the Schmidt family case study that we've spoken of several times in prior webinars, you will find a fully built out you will find an example of a fully built out private defense network, in this case in the inner city of Detroit. I would highly suggest that you take a look at that case study. I think you'll find it quite informative. And last but not least, I just want to come back to Pulse and what we do here. Our training ladder provides the fundamentals and tactics necessary to create a private defense network. So that concludes the content for today. First off,